At the end of part 2, there are the 2 title pages for parts 3 and 4.
Wow.
Okay? There you are.
I'm only paying for you, didn't I?
No problem. Just have them. I've got enough.
Okay, thank you.
So you've got,
Is this right at the beginning of part
that's part 1.
That's part one.
That's the whole schedule. Behind there is the chapters 1 to 14. That's part 2, 15, 24, where we are today. Then next week we start on part 3. Okay. Yes, that's what we're doing today. So you don't even need one of those. That's all right. You can sort those out at home. And they are extras.
Yeah.
So turn them over and use them as rough paper.
I do that.
Yeah. That's all right.
It's longer, isn't it?
The one I read is the story.
Yeah.
These are the notes to go with the stories. So if you want to hear the stories again, you've got to go to the chapter.
I see. And you have those
And they're the notes to go with the talks.
So it's 4:30,
Yes.
and I've set the stream going.
Right.
You let me know when you're
Hello,
ready and I'll
Jane.
turn the sound
Hello.
on.
Pat, isn't it?
Oh, a full house today.
Okay, hello, Margaret.
Hello. Music where you like. Hello, Peter, Margaret. I'm learning your names. Come sit where you like.
Well, this looks very professional, Sandra.
Barbara and I don't like to say Barbara and I were congratulating ourselves just now. It's only taken us to week 24.
And have you read your son away?
Yes, it was last week. Okay, thank you.
Okay. You ready to start? Give me a break when you're ready.
We'll sit on those.
You're going to sit on those, all right then.
It's what's called insulation.
What? That's what I'm saying. I'm sitting on the piece of paper as intuition.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And good afternoon to anybody else who's watching or who will watch in the future on YouTube. Good to see you. Well, we come to a very exciting climax this afternoon to the second part of this Bible story. And we're still in the exile. Are you ready? Off we go. Well, by the time that King Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, the Jews had been in exile for many years. And during this long time in Babylon, they had settled down in their suburb, and their children, their grandchildren were growing up, knowing only their parents' memories of their city, Jerusalem, which had been destroyed long ago. Well, much had happened since then, as we became aware last time in session 23. They now spoke Aramaic instead of Hebrew, and many of them had resisted the attractions of Babylon on Saturdays and used these Sabbaths to meet together in groups to worship Yahweh as best they could without a temple. They shared their memories, sang their songs, the Psalms, they're the songs, and studied Yahweh's law as never before. They also began to sort out all the written records that they had brought with them into exile. And they'd learnt, thanks to Ezekiel, as we found out last time, that Yahweh was still with them, even in Babylon, and that he had plans to rescue them one day. And in the meantime, their so-called schools, groups of people with a hero or reason for sticking together, they'd done much work, editing and recording their history. And the priestly schools had even begun to formulate the Pentateuch as we know it today. The prophetic groups studied the poems of their heroes, Amos, Hosea, and so on, editing them and copying them onto 4 long scrolls. The scroll of Isaiah, of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and all the smaller ones on one long 4th scroll. But within the Isaiah group, another prophet emerged during the later years of the exile, and we don't know who he was, or even whether he was a lone individual or the poetic secretary of a group's discussions. And yet, he became the greatest prophet of all. His prophecies were written in the new apocalyptic style, as if Yahweh himself was talking directly to them. And then they were added to the original Isaiah scroll. And he's therefore known to us as second or Deutero-Isaiah. And you only have to read the end of chapter 39 and the beginning of chapter 40 to realize what a difference there is in the literary style separating the 2 sections. The earlier chapters are set in Jerusalem with the temple, but the later ones nearly all in the apocalyptic style and obviously located in Babylon. Let's get rid of this. These poems in chapters 40 to 55 of the book of Isaiah are well worth an uninterrupted read from beginning to end. It's only 16 chapters, and out aloud if possible. And only that way do you get the full impact of their exciting discoveries about God, even though they seem so familiar to us now. But the poems roll on, and apart from only one short passage of prose, it's difficult to know when to pause. So just carry on, enjoy. Well, the exilic group had obviously meditated long and hard on the great theme of the original Isaiah. Cast your minds back. The theme, the holiness of Yahweh. Do you remember the call of the original Isaiah? Holy, 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 in the temple. And his whole theme of those 39 chapters echoes the holiness of Yahweh. Well, holiness meant his being totally separate and different from anything in creation. And he was, in fact, not part of creation at all, but above it, outside it, and thus unique. Second Isaiah declared that there just weren't any other gods at all to compare with him. Second Isaiah taught that it was Yahweh, in fact, who had created everything. He was the creator. And this wonderful, holy creator God had chosen them to be his special, chosen people. They knew that he loved them because they'd learnt the message of Hosea, and surely they could trust him now, like never before, to be in charge of their destiny. Now, this whole level of belief is called monotheism, and the Jews have finally got there. In fact, they were the first people in the world to get there. And monotheism says Yahweh is, or you can call him God now, Yahweh is the one and only God. There's no other God to compare with him. In fact, there aren't any. But please note, for the future, all the other gods we've been aware of don't just disappear. Some of them will reappear in this story when they've been reduced to the role of Yahweh's servants. That's a very different scene, isn't it? His servants, his messengers. Now, if any of you know any Greek, you know the Greek word for a messenger? It's an angelos, or as we would say, an angel. Well, plenty of those to come, isn't there? But we're going to pause at this high point of monotheism because it's interesting to realize that the Jews weren't isolated in the history of the world. They were part of the cultural movement of that century. And it was a fantastic century in the history of the world. The 6th century BCE. Spectacular. It was the century that politically saw the decline of all the former river-based empires, the Tigris and Euphrates in the Middle East, the Nile in Egypt, and also the river empires in India and China in the Far East. So as they declined in this century, we saw the rise of new style, land-based empires, quite new, dependent on road communications, not rivers. The first was Persia, and then we're concerned with Greece, followed by Rome. It was also this century, the 6th century BC, which saw the rise of new religions and philosophies in the world. It really was an outstanding century. We've got the writing of the Upanishads for the Hindus in India. That's the Hindu philosophy. To the enlightenment of the Buddha, same century in India. To the rise of the prophet Zoroaster. We're going to hear a lot more about that in future, in Persia. And on to the philosophy of Confucius in China, same century. And to the beginnings of Greek philosophy, which flourished 200 years later, and monotheism amongst the Jews. Now, what a century. But remember, the Jews had already by now even retold the ancient myths of Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh, those two myths of creation and the flood. They had reworked them as the work of Yahweh. So all the other gods have been pushed out, and these two myths are restated as the work of Yahweh, and of course we have them now in the early chapters of Genesis. What a century that was. Well, now we go back to the important chapters of 40 to 55, which reflect the high watermark of all Old Testament prophecy and theology. We're reaching a very high point. So let's look at some of the poems, and I'm sure a lot of them are familiar to you. The first three are in chapter 40. So just read that chapter and you've got the first three songs. The first one is like a trumpet call from heaven. Oh, wake up, good news, good news. Announcing the good news of comfort, which of course is strength, and hope for the future. Yahweh is about to act with strength. He will himself lead them out of slavery again and almost drive a motorway straight across the desert to take them back to Jerusalem. Wow, what an opening. But it doesn't end there. He's going to restore them in Jerusalem and at the same time caring for them as tenderly as a shepherd cares for his sheep. What a lovely picture. But remember, we've already had Ezekiel's teaching on the importance of Israel's leaders being the shepherds. The second poem carries on in verse 12, and it's in that new apocalyptic style, as if God is talking directly from heaven himself. And it reflects the questions of the wisdom teachers. Remember in the time of King Solomon, the schools in Jerusalem were dominated by scientists, really, of that early age, asking questions about creation and how it all happened. And this is known as the wisdom teaching, secular education, really, because it doesn't necessarily concern a God, like the scientists of today. So it reflects the questions of the wisdom teachers about creation and the natural world. But here we have Yahweh speaking to them, as if he were the lone master standing at the drawing board on his easel, designing the heavens, drawing the map of the seas and the mountains and the hills, and without any help. And in comparison, everything and everyone on earth is minuscule, minute, and other so-called gods just don't even count, being mere lumps of wood, however grandly they've been decorated with gold. Now, I'm going to do a little journey outside our remit, because if any of you know the book of Proverbs, which are the sayings of these wisdom teachers, in chapter 8, wisdom itself becomes a person. It's personified as the first being that came in, the first thing that came into being before creation, who then entertained Yahweh while he worked at his drawing board. It's a delightful picture. And then you jump, of course, to the fourth gospel, picking up this picture. In the beginning, no, not wisdom, the Word. Same thing now. Wisdom has become the Word of God before creation, meaning, of course, Jesus. Not then, but later. But that's just an interesting aside on this whole area of questions in the wisdom tradition. And we're going to hear a lot more about that in the future weeks. Anyway, back to the third poem in this chapter 40. It's the climax of the first of the three. It starts, "Have you not known? Have you not heard? To whom then will you compare me? Who is my equal?" asks the Holy One. "Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created all these?" And again, "Have you not known? Have you not heard? But Yahweh is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the world." Oh, how exciting it all is. And this melodious poetry rolls on, sounding best when it's read aloud. Yahweh is the Lord of space, or geography, if you like to call it that way. And he's next portrayed as the Lord of time, history, if you want to think about it that way. Space and time. And Yahweh's even able to summon up even foreigners to help serve his people in the future. Very different. He then tells them he's already doing so, rousing a victor from the east and summoning him to his service. Well, a ray of hope? "Yes," says Yahweh, and I quote, "Do not be afraid, for I am your God, your Redeemer, your Holy One of Israel." And then Yahweh then challenges any other gods to be able to do the same, to design creation, to know the future. And then he challenges them, if they exist, to bring their evidence into a law court. And in chapter 41 he says, "Set forth your case," says Yahweh, "and tell us what is to happen. Tell us the former things, what they are, so that we may consider them, and then tell what will happen next." And when they cannot, he chides, "You indeed are nothing, and your work is nothing at all." And the only passage written in these chapters in prose is in chapter 44. Just read it and enjoy it. It's a passage of hilarious mockery, describing the many uses of a tree. He starts with the blacksmith, using its wood to heat the fire for his hammering. But the heat also warms him when he's cold, and it bakes his bread when he's hungry. And then the carpenter comes along, takes the rest of it, fashions it into an idol, bows down to it and worships it and says, "Save me, for you are my God, this lump of wood." Well, most people were sophisticated enough to know that idols were only images, but it doesn't spoil the ridicule of bowing down to a lump of wood. Just enjoy it. I mean, these poems are absolutely delightful. But bedded into them are 4 very special poems, which enhance the original, but which have been highlighted by Christians as looking ahead to Jesus as the one and only person who is able to be the true servant. Now, you've got to forget that, put it out of your mind, and just get back to the people in exile listening to this prophet. We have to resist this. See the poems in their original context, relating to the Jews while they were still in Babylon. Now, these 4 poems are bedded into chapters 42, 49, 52, and 53. Now, you won't remember those, but in the notes, which you can collect at the end, they are listed for you. So you can then go to your Bible. In my Bible, I've got them coloured, so they just stand out and hit me every time I flip the pages. They're known as the 4 servant songs, and they described the servant of Yahweh. But the big open question is, for the people in Babylon, who is being referred to as the servant? Is the servant collectively the whole of Israel, Yahweh's chosen people? Or is it a small group of devout people? Or is it even a lone individual? And if it's an individual, who? And we have to search these poems to see if we can find any hint of autobiography in them. Well, the first song describes the servant as Israel, the whole collective group, whose offspring have received Yahweh's Spirit for the task that remains to be done. It's the servant. There's a task to be done. The second poem declares the servant's mission. Yes, to be addressed to Israel as before and always, but now we're told this is too light a task. The servant must now become, and I quote, "as a light to all the other nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." That is, they had to become God's missionaries to all the other nations of the earth. A very different prospect than they've ever countenanced before. The third song warns the servant that this will be no easy task, for such a commission will evoke much opposition and even personal violence against them or him. And we come to the fourth, the longest song. The violence will lead the servant to utter humiliation and even to an undeserved death. An undeserved death on behalf of all the others. There's a word for that, a vicarious death, standing in for somebody else. He would be led to death like a lamb to the slaughter. But Yahweh would redeem him as a reward and allot him with a portion with the great because he did not resist. And by this, I quote, he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Well, what on earth did all this mean to the Jews in exile, we may wonder? Well, it's impossible to know, but possibly not much, even to those who first heard them. Fortunately, however, they were faithfully added to the great scroll of Isaiah and survived. How wonderful. Well, who was this servant? God's Spirit was upon him. His mission was to be a light to the nations. He was given, we're told, the tongue of a teacher, even though he'd suffer painful insults like having his beard plucked out. And then as undeserved death before being vindicated because of his innocence. Well, Yahweh, their God, is now both creator, redeemer, the only ever God there ever has been. And this is the lesson of this great poetic prophecy, which reaches the highest point of all Old Testament theology. God is one and one only. He is the creator and the redeemer. You can't get better than that from a God who loves what he's created. Well, all this had been going on while King Nebuchadnezzar lived and ruled in Babylon. But after his death in 562, everything changed almost immediately. His massive and extravagant building program had created tremendous economic inflation, and it all suddenly came to a stop. I'm getting to feel as if we're on popular current situations. Many people suddenly found themselves out of work, and living standards fell immediately. The cost of living was going up. Even the traders were waking up to a new reality because their trade routes had recently been interrupted and the luxury goods they depended on were no more available. They were fearful too, because this was the work of a new conqueror who'd appeared on the international scene, Prince Cyrus of Anshan. And all of a sudden, their security under their old king had melted away, and they began to feel very vulnerable. Well, now let's have some pictures. Prince Cyrus of Anshan. As you can see, he was a very superb soldier. He was born about 600 BCE at a place called Anshan in the land of the Medes. His maternal grandfather was king of the Medes. Maternal grandfather. But Cyrus gradually fought off all his cousins and inherited the crown. So he became king of the Medes. And soon after, by peaceful agreement, he became king of the Persians too. So we now have the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. And I'm sure you've heard about them in your history lessons long ago. But his first campaigns of conquest took him westwards. Now let's look at the map. That's a very simplified map. You have the red bit, which is the Fertile Crescent that we've been concerned with all the years up to now. Egypt to the left. But the Persian Empire was to the north of the Fertile Crescent. It started on the right-hand side, where it says Persian Empire. That's where the land of the Medes and Persians were. But his first campaign took him westwards, north of the Fertile Crescent, through Turkey, all the way through Turkey, well, Anatolia as it was then. He came to the land of Lydia, where King Croesus was, and he demolished them. Got to the coastline, and there was a little island saying, "Ooh, trade, ooh, good. Yes, let's join in." And the island of Cyprus readily volunteered to become part of this empire. for the trade links. But Cyrus did not go further than the Turkish coast. He saw the Greek islands, but went no further. He turned back, in fact, and went back to Persia. But then he was still restless, and he set off eastwards. And he went this time to the right of the map, and he went all the way through Afghanistan and into North India. It was a huge territory, stretching from what we now know as Constantinople or Istanbul, right through to the Punjab in India. What an empire. Certainly was the biggest that the world had ever seen. And that was only for starters. He got as far as the Indus River in northern India, but by then he'd heard that Babylon was descending into political chaos. So he turned back and went in that direction, capturing the city of Susa on the way. Susa is just to the, well, if you can follow the red band round to the right, Susa is just near the coast where the red gives way to the Persian Empire. So that's where Cyrus conquered on his way to Babylon. Well, Nebuchadnezzar had died in 562, and during the next 7 years, there were 3 different kings in quick succession, which is never good for a country. These 3 kings were either deposed or killed by military rivals. So it was a time of disintegrating chaos. But at the end, another soldier called Nabonidus seized the throne and held it for the next 16 years. But he didn't do much for Babylon, I'm afraid, because he wasn't one of them. He'd been born at Haran. Do you remember that northern city at the top of the Fertile Crescent? That's where he'd been born, part of the Babylonian Empire, yes. But he was not one of them. He was born in Haran, son of the priestess of the temple there. If you think back to the stories of Abraham, the temple there was dedicated to the moon god, Sin or Sign. And Nabonidus was son of the high priest there, or the priestess there. And he remained loyal to that god all his life. You remember, Abraham had travelled from Ur, the moon-worshipping city in the far south, to Haran on his way. Now, Nabonidus took far more care of the moon worshippers in his empire than he did of the Babylonians and their sun god Marduk. He even tried to elevate his moon god above Marduk and in Babylon itself, to the utter dismay of the Babylonians. And of course to the priests of that temple, who found their status being diminished gradually in the eyes of the people. And when Nabonidus failed to turn up for the great New Year festival of Marduk, it was a huge shock. The priests began to lose their authority over the citizens of Babylon, and chaos seemed to loom. Unbelievably, Nabonidus didn't even visit the city of Babylon for the next 10 years. It was left in the careless charge of his son, Prince Belshazzar. Not king, prince. Times were moving from bad to worse, and the discontented priests, as well as the wealthy traders in luxury goods, began to mutter. They wanted change. And the Jews and the other exiles began to hope that change would indeed come and bring freedom for them, especially those followers of 2nd Isaiah who'd heard the name of Cyrus described as Yahweh's appointed saviour for them. Was the time coming soon, and at long last, when a change of regime might bring about change for them too? Could they even soon think about returning to Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple? And at last, in the spring of the year 539, in the springtime, Nabonidus did return, and he did attend a splendid festival of Marduk, but it was too late. Some of his soldiers and people of the city were already beginning to escape to go and join the army of Cyrus. And that summer, 539, Cyrus met the Babylonian army at a town called Opis, and they surrendered to him, just like that. Babylon itself was within his sights. He ordered his men to divert the river Euphrates. Can you believe it? There was a canal, and he ordered them to divert the waters of the river into the canal, and thus lowered the level of the river until it was only thigh deep. That was enough. On the 29th of October that same year, the invaders trudged through the depleted riverbed until they entered the city of Babylon without a fight. And Nabonidus surrendered. The mighty city of Babylon had fallen, 539 BCE. And Cyrus was now master of that whole new Persian empire, including the Babylonian Empire now, the biggest the world had ever seen to this time, to this point of history. Cyrus did not command the destruction of Babylon. The records say, let's have another picture. Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. He surrendered, and we come to King Cyrus. The records say there was peace in the city while Cyrus spoke his greeting to them. And his first order was to have the temple of Marduk restored to its former glory and importance. The priests and the people were very impressed. And such was the enlightened policy of Cyrus, as he established himself as the patron of all conquered gods. No parched fields for his conquests, only peaceful cooperation. What a change. This is a new style of empire. But the evidence for all this is in the British Museum. You can go and see it for yourself. It's on the Cyrus cylinder. That's all. It's no more than 8.5 inches long. It's tiny, but the writing is all the way round. It's made of baked clay and covered in cuneiform writing. It extols Cyrus as the benefactor of the citizens of Babylon, who improved their lives, repatriated displaced peoples, and restored temples and cult sanctuaries all over the region. Now, on the cylinder, there is no specific mention of the Jews, but scholars accept that it did include them. And it's quoted twice in the book of Ezra in the Old Testament, first chapter in Hebrew and in chapter 6 in Aramaic. But in considering himself to be Yahweh's patron too, Cyrus actually did become Yahweh's means of deliverance for the Jews, giving them permission to go home. Home. And he couldn't repatriate their gods, because there weren't any statues of their god. So he gave them gifts of money to rebuild the temple, to re-establish the worship of Yahweh, plus all the sacred vessels that had been looted from the temple by Nebuchadnezzar many years before. What an enlightened policy for the new conqueror. At last, after 70 long years away from home, rejoicing, and did they rejoice. But then, after all the rejoicing, there were some among the Jews, and many, who began to say, do we really want to go back to Jerusalem? We'll have to pay for our journeys this time. But our homes are here, in Babylon now, and they're comfortable homes. Our business colleagues are here in Babylon too, not far away in an unknown Jerusalem, which was left in ruins. And of all the things we've learned over the years here in Babylon, we know now that we can worship Yahweh, the Creator, in any part of his world. So why go back? And many of them decided not to go. What a turnaround in the books. And in the end, only a few, mainly the priestly families, of course, only a few were determined to go because they still thought they couldn't offer all the traditional sacrifices to Yahweh in any other place than the temple at Jerusalem. In 536, a small group set off. The others stayed behind but wished them well and contributed lots of money to the costs of rebuilding the temple, as well as the expenses for the travellers. And so we come to the end of part 2 of this long story of the Bible. Now, cast your minds back. Part 1 ended in session 14, so it sounds a long time ago now, doesn't it? But we finished part 1 with the theological heights of the Yahwist, who'd pulled together all the J-code and established the foundation of what became the Old Testament, all in the setting of Yahweh's in control, and this is his story. And that was a great highlight with which we finished part 1. But do you remember, thanks to the scholar Gerhard von Rad, who examined all the things he could find that might have been reflecting the Yahwist himself, who's an unknown person to us. And he examined the strange passage in which Abraham is recorded as questioning Yahweh, how many good men will it take to stop you from destroying Sodom and Gomorrah? And the Yahwist had asked in Genesis, I think it's chapter 16, but I haven't checked it, God, you're going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. But supposing there are 50 good men in the city, you're going to destroy them as well? Or will you not? Says God. No, perhaps I won't. But what if there are only 40? No, said God. That's enough. I won't do it. 30? No, says God. Don't think I will. 20? 15? 10? And the Yahwist goes no further. Do you remember that? It's a very, very strange passage in Genesis. Part 2 is now ended. And that same question is hovering in the theological heights of 2nd Isaiah, whose prophecy culminated in the question of Yahweh's servant, who would suffer in the process. Was it a group? 50, 40, 30, 20, 15, 10, 5, or in chapter 53, 1. highlight. Well, at this point, we have reached the halfway session in this long story of the Bible. We've had 23 sessions up to today. We've got 23 sessions still to go. This is the halfway point. Now, many people, of course, switch off at this point. They don't want to know any more from the Old Testament, thank you very much. They can jump from the servant songs straight to the New Testament. And most Christians do. So you're on a voyage of discovery, because we're going to stick with part 3. We're going back to Jerusalem with the brave travellers. And we're going to encounter 200 years of political, military stability and peace before war breaks out again. That's a long time. And part 3 eventually, long time after this, eventually ends again in total disaster for both Jerusalem and the Jews in the year 70 AD, 40 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. When that disaster happened, only 2 groups of Jews survived in the long term. You remember the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and all those, the terrorists and all the other groups that we meet in the New Testament. Only 2 really survived. One group was the Pharisees, because the Sadducees were all killed. The Pharisees survived, and so did another group, followers of the Way, who were first called Christians in the northern city of Syria called Antioch. Sadly now in the news at the moment as Antioch, devastated in the earthquake. We're seeing it night after night, the devastation in that city. So I don't think there's much left of the original Antioch in Syria that the first Christians knew. But there, in that city, the followers of the Way were first called Christians, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles. So the Pharisees and the Christians were the survivors after the disaster at the end of part 3. So in part 4, we'll follow the fortunes of those Christians and finish the whole story with choosing which books of the many possibles that would become the New Testament of the completed Bible. So that's our spread for the next 23 sessions. But there's a warning. Have you heard of the Apocrypha? Right. Well, these are a whole collection of books that went missing from our Protestant Bibles. They were there originally, they're not there now. And we have to thank Martin Luther for losing them. And that's another story altogether. We're not getting hooked on that one. You just take my word for it. But the original longer list was preserved by the Roman Catholics because they never changed their Latin Vulgate. We're going to finish our story with the creation of that Vulgate, and that survived from the year 432 AD right up to the modern day. And it was only after the Second Vatican Council, about 50 years ago now, that the Pope gave permission for the Bible, that Latin Vulgate, to be translated into the language of different peoples. And so the English and American scholars got to work and produced the Roman Catholic modern English version, which is known as the Jerusalem Bible. And if you have access to that, it's a very good translation, but all the books of the Old Testament are as in the original order. And they strike us as very jumbled up and mixed around. But that's the original Bible. And if you have a Protestant Bible, like I do at home, you have to find those extra books put in between the Old and New Testament and called the Apocrypha. Now, lots of people think they don't count, but they do. There's some marvellous books in the Apocrypha, and we're going to use them for the part 3 of this course. So if your Bibles at home haven't got a good translation of the apocryphal books, please put in a plea for somebody to give you one for your birthday present. because the books there are fascinating. Not all of them, but the ones we're going to use really are worth a look. Some of them have great importance historically, so it gives us knowledge that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Some of them are very theologically thoughtful. This marvellous God, they wanted to go on learning more and more about him. Yes, we learn more about him in those books. And some just jolly good stories to read, and especially the story of Tobit. Do you know the story of Tobit? Well, he had a son called Tobias who had a pet dog. I'll leave you to get the story and read it for yourself. We're going to finish there. Next time, part 3. Look at that map of the Persian Empire, which now incorporates the red bit.
Right, it's
That's
not
the
on
Babylonian Empire.
Barbara, it's not on our screen. It's not there.
Isn't it? Oh. It's gone. But we'll carry on that story next time. Well, thank you for coming. Hope you've enjoyed it. Go and enjoy the poetry of 2nd Isaiah. It really is delightful. And have a look at the story of Tobit in the Apocrypha if you've got one. All right? See you next time. Then it's actually next Sunday. Not 2 weeks' time this time. Next Sunday, 4:30. Well, thank you for coming. And it's cold outside, so don't delay on your way home back to your comfort of your warmth. There's notes for you to pick up. There's only one sheet of notes backing up all that I've said today. And apart from that, see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.